Messaging from some of the biggest donors for Wisconsin Badgers football and the administration. Is it falling deaf on fans' ears? Let's go.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, Badger fans? Welcome to Locked On Badgers. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being an everydayer, part of this community. Really do appreciate you. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Download the app today. Today's episode, we are talking about messaging from Ted Kellner, a massive donor, the messaging from Chris McIntosh. Is it falling on deaf ears? What comes next? Big picture Wisconsin Badgers talk with Curtis Holland Jr. For people who don't tune into every show, man, the grandson of Lou Holland Sr, UW Athletic Hall of Famer, but he did so much more. I didn't realize it until I started talking to you, everything that your grandparents or your grandfather did, your dad has done. The 30-second spiel on your grandfather and the amazing life that he kind of lived.
Yeah, I mean, my grandfather played in the late 50s, early 60s. He played on the 63 Rose Bowl team with Pat Richter. And they were the number 1, number 2 matchup with USC. Unfortunately lost, just fell short on a comeback in that game to kind of almost propel Wisconsin to another level. Unfortunately, sort of following that, we sort of hit a little bit of the dark ages of the team. But, that's where he kind of came from. He was ag business major and, kind of rose up through the business ranks in Chicago and helped open a lot of doors, especially for the African-American community in the 1960s and early 70s in Chicago. And so, he used to be on TV every week on Wall Street Week in Chicago. And then, he had opened a couple companies in the area. And he had always been a huge, benefactor, supporter of Wisconsin football, Wisconsin athletics, throughout his life. And unfortunately passed away from Alzheimer's probably about 10 years ago now. And so, he sort of started a research institution and a focus in Alzheimer's at Wisconsin. My dad has carried on that legacy. He also played football at Wisconsin in the 80s. Didn't have quite as much success as my grandpa did on those teams, but, he's always been intricately tied with the program as well. Now is one of the key figures in continuing to promote the Alzheimer's Research Foundation at the University of Wisconsin. That's actually been doing a lot of really great work. In fact, the first FDA-approved drug that can be prescribed to Alzheimer's came from Wisconsin Research directly. So that's kind of been a lot of what they've done, but also just been heavily involved in the athletics as well. And, kind of tying the two together, doing fundraisers for both athletics and different research programs.
Man, it's incredible stuff. And I don't want to, we could do a whole show. And I think this summer I might want to just on your grandfather, if you'd be willing. But one of the things he said is, it's important for me to kind of stop this. And I'm paraphrasing, but this Alzheimer's, epidemic, this thing, my generation, and maybe it's too late for me, but maybe for my kids or other people, we can kind of stop this disease. Just an incredible life, man. And as always, Curtis is a great dude too. And we're glad to get into it. Some big picture thoughts on Wisconsin Badgers. I think a big question, one of the questions came up in the Discord, Curtis, was Ted Kellner. This is from one commenter here, but just he came out with a letter. I would call it a vote of confidence to some degree, a big donor for the Wisconsin Badgers football. How did that message kind of come across? Was it received well? What happened here?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think this points to what I would say is there's a disconnect between fans and maybe, more alumni that aren't necessarily as heavily invested in the upper tier, management levels of Wisconsin, like maybe some of the more higher level donors are. And then the higher level donors in the university administration. And I think there's a disconnect there. It's something that I've noticed because I kind of have my foot in both camps. I hear a lot about what's going on with the administration and things like that. I also am heavily invested in the fan space and, talking on the podcast with you and being in a Discord, going to games, talking to people. Right. And so I kind of see both perspectives. And I think they both have things to say that are positive. And I think both at times maybe missed the mark a little bit. And so with Ted Kellner, he's been one of the foundational pillars of the University of Wisconsin athletics. And so from my perspective, kind of seeing both worlds, if he doesn't want to donate money, like that's his pride. He can do what he wants. He's already given a disproportionate massive amount to the university that's allowed it to do a lot of things it's been able to do over the last 10, 20, 30 years. Right. And so, if he's saying, look, I'm going to support our athletics department, I'm going to let them do what they do, more power to him. He can do what he wants as far as I'm concerned. And without him, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. So, that's kind of how I feel about Kellner in that perspective. And I think there should be a level of like, look, I get people are frustrated, but you got to understand you can't bite the hand that feeds you. These are the guys that keep the system going. Now that said, there is some element of like, is it tone deaf? Kellner, he's like I said, he's been around, he's seen different administrations, seen different coaches, he's been through the business cycle 1,000 times over. He knows how these things they go up and down. It's just what it is. And so from his perspective, where he comes from, what he's saying makes a lot of sense. He's like, look, there's some certain limitations that we have right now that at the end of the day, I trust Chris McIntosh to work through. And you can agree to disagree on that, but that's sort of where he stands. But I think that in the greater scheme of like the noise and a lot of the words going on around the program, that's tough to hear, because now you have a guy who can basically write a check and make some things happen. And he's coming out and basically saying, I'm just gonna let this one play itself out and see what happens. Whereas a lot of fans have kind of moved on to the point where it's like, well, look, we already see what's happening here. Like, this isn't working. What we're doing is not going to work, and it's not presenting us well at all. And so that disconnect is entirely valid. And I think that while I understand where Kellner was coming from, and again, like, this wasn't like a statement he just gave out. This came off an interview where he was asked this question specifically. It wasn't like he came out and made a statement. And I think that also gets twisted. He wasn't opining for the sake of opining.
Right.
He doesn't do that. But he got interviewed, he got asked a question, and he answered it, right? And so, at the end of the day, is it tone deaf? I don't know. I think it's what he genuinely feels in the moment. He has faith in the current administration, and that's something we can maybe talk about a little bit more as we kind of go into Mac's message as well.
Is there any? I love what you said there. If it wasn't for a guy like Ted Kellner and others, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. I think that's a really important point to bring to the forefront. Is there any blame, though, for donors? And I just want to speak hypothetically big picture. If something maybe isn't working and you keep investing in that something, is there some level of blame or accountability that should be held there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always a little bit of accountability there. What I would say is that when it comes to the donor space, no one has to donate anything. So you could, like, I mean, and we've talked about this before. There are plenty of alumni from the University of Wisconsin-Madison who don't donate anything. People who have enough money that could write one check and solve all our problems tomorrow, right? There's plenty of people like that who don't even engage with the university. They just don't have a desire to, right? And that's their prerogative. Like, if I ran a business and I had a lot of money, I could do what I want with it, right? And that's kind of the reality of how these things work. And so, on one hand, it's like we're grateful that they do that, but on the other hand, there is an element of like, I mean, if we had more money, we could get more done. And that's just kind of the reality of how these things work. What I would say when it comes to, are they to blame for the current situations? I would say that there's an element of, I think, allocation and like the decision of where to apply the money and how to go about getting the money that maybe needs to be improved. And I think could probably be done better, right? And we've talked about this in the past. I think one of the big issues that we have had is that we haven't necessarily prioritized football in a way that would put us at a higher tier in the Big Ten. And this doesn't just start now. This goes back, a long time. We always had the reputation, and to some degree, it was a badge of honor that we were the team that did more with less, right? And so we always were about that. Well, we're getting to a point now in college football where there's a paid price to action. And the reality is, if we don't pay that price to action, we're going to have 10-2 seasons. Now, that's not to excuse everything that's going on with the football team. We'll get to that, but it's just a reality of the situation. And so what I often say is it's not an or problem when it comes to the coach or to the resources or the money. It's an and problem. You need both. You need good coaching and you need the resources to be successful in 2025. And I think again, I don't want to say I fault the donors, but where I would fault the donors is just that they didn't necessarily recognize that as early as they needed to.
Is that I could do this an hour show on this today, and we don't have time for it, unfortunately. Coming up next, we got to take a break. I want to ask you, is that an administration maybe failure or a donor failure if this wasn't started years ago? I also want to get into Mac's letter, just your overall interpretation of what that was, why it was there, and then some big picture football questions, plus some questions from the Discord, man. We have a ton to get into with Curtis Holland on today's show. But first, a quick second for our great friends of the show. Quick second, as always, to say thank you for tuning in to Locked On Badgers. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there is no better place on the planet to get in on the action than over at FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you miss the start of a game, or if you want to maybe ride a hot hand, if Devin Booker is going off on a heater, if Giannis is going off on a heater, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks and everything in between. That can keep you engaged in the game, even if it gets out of control, if it gets crazy, plus parlays, futures, teaser spreads. It's all over there on FanDuel, and college basketball is literally on the doorstep. So if you want to get in on that Badger action, men's or women's, it looks like both programs could be pretty good this year. Right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first bet your first $5 bet wins. Head over to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Now let's jump back into this with Curtis. And I think what you were saying there, I remember specifically an interview with Travis Frederick years ago, and he was talking about the weight room being worn down. And you used a really good term there. It was a badge of honor. He acted like we're doing all of this, and this weight room is like, I've been to other places. It's not comparable, and we're still kicking their butts. And I was like, yeah, good job. But it's also like, yeah, for years, Bielema was losing assistants because we couldn't pay them because the facilities weren't good enough. We were struggling recruiting at times. So this is a long-standing thing that is not just Fickle. Should this have been addressed earlier from an administration standpoint? Like, I guess you talked about we're a little behind. We shouldn't have been behind, though, right?
Yeah, and that's what's tough, because the way that the university works is it's not necessarily we can just stroke a pen, write an order, and just do it, right? There's a lot of pull in multiple directions when it comes to the university. Athletics is just one of those pulls, right? It's disproportionate in terms of its reach and its vision, in terms of like football is the marketing for the university, and so it has the largest image across the country, right? But a lot of the work that gets done at Wisconsin is deeper than football, and it's much, much more expensive, a lot more rigorous. The research programs that we're working on, specifically with Alzheimer's, but other research things as well, that costs as much, if not more, yearly than football does, right? And that doesn't necessarily get pub, right? But that's a lot of the things that they do. So the money's constantly getting pulled in different directions. And the reality when it comes to the state of Wisconsin is that there's a couple limiting factors that affect how much money we can get from the state, and also how much we can spend on a yearly basis, that some other schools, based on their own state laws, don't necessarily have to adhere to, right? And so what you're finding in the NIL age, and this is actually interesting because you can look around at different states with different laws and see how it affects, is we have hard legal limitations on what we can do. For example, some teams can go into debt and they can fire a coach and say, you know what, we're going to, go into this year in our athletic department being in debt. Wisconsin can't do that, right? There's things where you want to get someone in NIL, right? And, maybe they're looking at 1 to 2 million. Well, 1 to 2 million at Wisconsin gets taxed really heavily. Well, there's 17 states that don't have an income tax, right? So, I can just go to that school and they can pay less and still get more money because they're not getting taxed on that money, right? So these are how a lot of these things play out. And these are some things that are natural barriers that hurt Wisconsin. Now, that said, the way I kind of see it is like these are obstacles, but they're solvable problems. We have to think about how, instead of using these as, we can't deal with this because there's an obstacle in the way, it's like, well, how do we get around that, or how do we work through that obstacle? And kind of what's happening this year is I think the administration is finally starting to see like, hey, we can't mess around with this anymore. Like, we have to go in and make the right calls, make the right decisions to put our team in a position to be successful. We are, or at least on average, usually top 10 to 20 in revenue generated from athletic department every single year. So there's zero excuse to be losing to a team like a Maryland, or losing to teams like Iowa, or losing to teams, or being in games with teams like Middle Tennessee, right? There's zero excuses for that. So what that tells me is that we're not allocating our resources properly enough to ensure football success. And I think, and we'll get into the Max Letter details, but it wasn't, and this is where I think, again, the messaging was not great. It was not effective, and it wasn't heard properly. What, at least from what I know from inside the organization, what Mac was trying to say is, hey, look, here's the deal. We realize that right now it's not going right, and we've made some mistakes, and we need to fix those. So we're going to reallocate some of our resources, which are coming organically internally. We're going to reallocate and reshape them to free up cash for football. Like, that's what they're committed to doing, because they've realized that football is their best marketing piece. So that needs to be a priority. And so they're moving some things around. And he says it's going to take time. It is going to take time, because we've been operating a certain way for a long time, and some paradigms are going to shift. And it's not easy because, like, for example, let's think about it like this. You have the reconstruction of the practice facility, right? That's a $285 million project. That's not a write-off, right? In doing so, you basically torpedoed the indoor track program. And there's a lot of people who are upset about that. But I think you and I would both agree that when it comes to football, one, football makes enough money for the indoor track program to exist in the first place. And two, we needed to do that. We don't even have a full field indoor facility. We needed one. And just based on the real estate and the way the university works, that was the only place we could do it. So it's a trade-off, right? There's no real great options in this space. There's trade-offs. You make a decision, and that decision has consequences. And so it's not going to happen overnight, but it does need to happen. And you're seeing that the university is realizing that it made a mistake, and it's trying to adjust. Now, here's the other thing. It will never admit that, but that's just how it works. That's how a lot of these organizations function, right? And so that's what we're seeing happen right now. And, does it come to, fans giving more money? Well, that is needed, sure. But at the same time, I don't think that was the core ask in that post. I think it was more just saying, hey, look, guys, we hear you, and we're trying to make changes. I just don't think that the way that letter was written and the way it was disseminated, and then the way it caught fire in an already angry and frustrated fan base and media, which they have every right to be angry and frustrated, didn't help anything.
Yeah, this is you mentioned a frustrated ecosystem. People are ready to pounce on anything that they can. And to me, that letter, there was just no awareness of that. And I can get behind what you're saying here. But it came across tone deaf. It came across as, please give us more money. I said this right after the show, and I said, I mean, it's fine, but you needed to start that letter with some accountability, in my opinion, if you're going to release it. And I think people would have embraced that a little bit more. Speaking of that, so we talked resources. I'm tracking what you're saying. And by the way, great insight as always. There's an element here of, though, fans will push back and say resources need to get better. Check. But the return on investment resources that are there hasn't been good enough. I think that's where the fan pushback would come.
No, and I think that's entirely a fair perspective to have. I mean, when you look at what this team is, and again, this is why I say it's an and, not an or, right? And, when you look at the team and the way it's performed, there's certain things that need to change in order for us to be competitive again. And I think first and foremost, it's the recognition that like what we've been doing and how we've been trying to run this program under Fickle is not how Wisconsin can be successful in modern college football. With Fickle, I see a lot of parallels between coaches that have been fired this season, James Franklin specifically, and Brian Kelly at LSU. And the parallels I kind of see there's a lot of, flash, pomp, and circumstance. There's a lot of recruiting wins and, focus on that space. But when you watch Kelly's LSU teams or Penn State's Nittany Lion teams, you don't really see development. You don't really see them improve year over year. You kind of see them stay about the same. Now, the talent level at both those institutions being so much higher than it is here, just based on their talent pool and who they have on their team, allows them more grace in that lack of development, because you have the athletes that are capable, if any given Sunday they play, or any given Saturday they play their best game, they can beat anybody, in the country, because they have the talent to do that. Wisconsin isn't at that level from a talent perspective. And so when you run your organization like that type of team, which tracks Fickle's development, you got to understand, Fickle came from Cincinnati, which had the top roster in their conference. And then he came from Ohio State, which had the top roster in our conference, right? So that's the type of coaching tree that he came from, right? And so in order for him to make strides moving forward, he has to change into realizing that we are in Iowa. We are a Northwestern. We are a, Illinois under Bielema. We are a team like a Vanderbilt now with Clark Lee. We are a team that has to take what it has and build that into something better than it is. And that's what we've gotten very, very fortunate with Barry, with Bielema, with even Gary a little bit, but like with Paul Chris especially, and Jim Leonard. Every single year, those players came in, got stronger, got better, and learned the game of football at a high level, so that over time they developed and became the teams that we knew and loved.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Is there confidence that Luke Fickle can make that adaptation? Or because sometimes you get to a spot where I actually don't think he's a bad coach. Like I don't, but sometimes fits aren't perfect. Is there a way for him at this point to make that adaptation?
Well, and that's the thing that's really hard to judge. And this is where it kind of goes also into the technical and the practical realities of this, right? It is tough. I mean, the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? It is tough for coaches to make those changes. And there's been elements that have shown that he's willing to take some accountability. Obviously, one thing I'll give Fickle credit over the two coaches that I mentioned earlier that got fired is that Kelly and Franklin would often both blame their teams. Fickle never does that. He blames himself. Now, does it translate into anything technically changing? I haven't seen that as much, but at least he's not out there throwing his team under the bus, right? And there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that he could say to throw his team under the bus, but he won't do that because he's a good person. And I think, to your point, I think he's still got that good coach in him. And, obviously going into this year, it was very clear that the defense they wanted to run that they brought over from Cincinnati wasn't working. It was very clear that Longo, the air raid system, wasn't going to work. And so he made those changes, right? The rest of the team, though, you still see sort of that lack of improvement, and you see that lack of fundamental play. I was talking about last week, I was watching Indiana play, I watched Iowa play, and then I watched Wisconsin play. And the contrast between the form, the fundamentals, reading the right holes, filling the right gaps, taking the right angles, wrapping up on tackles, like that attention to detail just wasn't present with us. Now, it was raining, so obviously, everybody's sliding all over the place, but that affects Oregon too, right? And at the end of the day, fundamentals travel. And so these are the things that, like, if Fickle's going to continue to be the coach, which at this point, I'll just say this, I'm 99% confident, barring some type of scandal, he's our coach going into 2026. Whatever fans want to feel about that, it is what it is. If we actually want to improve, then we need to work on those fundamentals. We need to get our strength and conditioning back in line, and we need to, continue to drive home the things that have made us successful forever. The thing that gives me some encouragement that, like, the team isn't all the way lost is the level of heart they played with on last Saturday shows me they at least care about the coach and the staff, which is a good thing, because the difference between a team that's fully quit and a team that's, it's still there. It's just not necessarily good enough to do anything with it. And that's what I would say about a lot of the play we saw last week, is that the team played its ass off, but it wasn't set up for success in a way that allowed it to actually win that game.
Well, and they also had a quarterback that was 7 of 21. I mean, maybe that's what you mean by not set up for success, but you can't win in college football if your quarterback plays that bad. And that's not, I've said this repeatedly, it's not on Hunter Simmons. He just isn't ready for this moment. And credit to him for going out there and taking the shots. All right, we got to take one more quick second. We got questions from the Discord for Curtis, including a potential parallel between Greg Gard and Luke Fickle. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick second for our friends of the show over at Mazda. Mazda crafts cars for those who, for those people who want to do more than simply move. Mazda delivers confidence with every single ride. More IHS top safety pick awards than anyone else as of August 2025. Footwork, craftsmanship, craftsmanship, Japanese craftsmanship in every detail, from metallic accents to available Napa leather upholstery. You make everyday drives feel like anything but, because we spend so much time in our cars. We throw in podcasts, maybe Locked On Badgers. You're going from point A to point B. You might as well do it in some style, do it in some comfort, do it in a spot that's relaxing and not stressful, because there's so many other spots in our lives that are stressful. That's what Mazda's created. They've created a little relaxation ecosystem where you can get from point A to point B, because they've thought of every little detail that'll make you feel better on your ride. Like every player, Mazda sweats every detail, because when you make every move count, impossible becomes relevant. Mazda, move and be moved. All right, let's jump through these. A couple questions for you, man. I was excited to get some other thoughts into this, especially with kind of the perspective you have, which I think is pretty unique. The first one here, I like this one from Cheesehead44. A lot of people wanted Gard fired when he first took over, or they wanted him fired because he missed the tournament. He had what is the equivalent of kind of a disaster year for the Badgers, like Luke Fickle did last year. Do you think Fickle can do the same thing, go through growing pains now, then become a solid team down the road?
Well, I can answer it like this. This is exactly and you got to understand, Greg Gard did this already. So the paradigm within the university leadership is exactly this, right? This is probably what they're thinking. This is where they're kind of hedging their bet here and saying, yeah, they believe he can. The way I was raised up in business and where I've worked in the past is, I would say that it's tough to make that call based on past performance. But like I said, he's shown the willingness in spurts to listen and change the process. Again, Longo was a failure. He cut that off. The defense we were running prior to this year was a failure. We couldn't stop the run. Now we can't stop the pass. There's a lot that goes into that too, injuries and whatnot, what have you, as well as just, and I will say this, and I'm not trying to necessarily make excuses, but there is something to be said about the fact that we have no junior class, right? It's like we have some seniors, and then we have some guys that are juniors, sure, but like we have no upper senior level of a team, right? Because that all got kind of mixed in with transfers and guys that transferred out when the coaches were switched and all these other things. And so we have a lot of youth, a lot of redshirt freshmen, sophomores, and then, true freshmen that are impacting the team. And you can already see that they're playing incredibly well. can we develop them moving forward? And will they stay with the program is the big question. But again, the way they played on Saturday tells me, there's probably a chance that they want to stay with the program. When you hear people who are tied to players on the team in the Discord, there's a level of that they want to stay and see this out. They like Fickle. They want Fickle to continue to be coach. A lot of our recruits that we're bringing in still want to play for Fickle. So there is an element that, like, because of that, I get the sense that, yeah, he probably could. But again, it's an old dog, new tricks. We have to see if he does that. And, from where I sit, it's tough for me to say that he's capable of it. But as it stands right now, I believe that's what hiring a new coach, blowing up the whole situation, and paying all the money that would take to do that, and then starting over from scratch, running that same bet where we're saying, do we think this coach can do that? You know what I'm saying?
Talk me through the quarterback situation, just your big kind of short perspective of it, because I think no matter what, they have to start someone else against Washington. That's where I'm at. That's just my opinion. It's not what I'm hearing. But I don't think you can run Hunter Simmons back out there. And if they do, that tells me maybe certain players, again, this is just me speculating. This is not me reporting anything, but it means maybe certain players have checked out, or maybe you've once again failed to develop a young talent a la Evers, Mabry. They can't start Hunter Simmons against Washington, right?
I mean, that's what I would say. Now, I will say this. I don't have much more insight into the locker room. I have a lot more insight into the administration than I do the locker room. So I can't quite comment on what's going on in the locker room with the players and whatnot. And what I said before, even though there's a lot of players still playing hard, you can definitely see some players that maybe have, so take a step back from that. And one of the most difficult things to do, I've been on teams that were, 3-9. I've been on teams that were 15-0 playing lacrosse. Like, I know that dynamic. And when you're losing, it is very, very difficult to stay invested at a high level as a player. It's tough. And so I get that. I get that perspective a lot. What I would say, though, is when it comes to the quarterbacks, if it was me, I would probably either A, play Danny O'Neal, and whatever is going on behind the scenes or not, to me, is kind of irrelevant because I need to see the dude play in the game. Or I'd play Carter Smith, because at the end of the day, we've seen that a lot of the freshmen that we've had come in and play have stepped up and played well. And maybe we get some picks, maybe we get some bad reads, bad decisions, but like, how is that any different than what we already have? So that's kind of what I'm looking at there if it was me. Whether or not that actually happens, again, I can't really say what's going on behind the scenes because I honestly just don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm at. Brett asks, is the wide zone scheme just not a good fit? To me, offensive line injuries have played a massive part in this. Obviously, we've talked about that a lot. Is maybe throwing this into a scheme versus Grimes thing. What specifically hasn't worked with this scheme?
Well, I'll give you a perspective. I mean, Iowa runs the wide zone, and they're doing just fine, right? So I think the reality is it's not a simple scheme to learn, and it takes certain types of athleticism in the offensive line. And because of our injuries and because of our lack of, again, that position is also hampered not just by injuries, but the complete lack of an upper class, right? And so because of that, you have a lot of young guys that are filling the roles and having to step in, and they're just not ready. Like they're just not. And on top of that, the transfers that kind of came in as more backups because we had an offensive line more or less set up going into the year. You can talk about, well, we should have had more backups. But again, that goes to the fact we had no junior class. I mean, Dylan Barrett starting center at Iowa State right now. He's doing good. We lost Wettig and last year and Rucci's, starting at Penn State. Obviously, you can think about how that's going in comparison. But like we lost a lot of guys that could be the guys that could step in. And, you can only do so much when we're asking you to come transfer to our program and not be a starter. And we're not giving you maybe the same amount of NIL that another school would give. People say, well, we lost out on an offensive tackle to Cincinnati. It's like, well, Cincinnati probably put significantly more money into that, not because they have more, but because they could compared to where we were at, right? Because we're already paying our starters. We're already doing these other things too. We're bringing a guy in that we don't even know if he's going to start until Hayward got injured. So, those are the kind of things that make that difficult to really make that assessment. Now, as to the wide zone thing, it's a complicated scheme and it takes a while to learn. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And because of the situation we're in with players, I don't think you're going to see it really manifest into something elite. Now, we saw some improvement against Oregon, and I think we can run this scheme. I think it's a scheme that we can do with the types of athletes at O-line we've gotten in the past. I think we can run this scheme. I think it's a combination of the fact that we're playing a lot of young offensive linemen, a lot of guys that maybe we hadn't intended necessarily to start. And, we have a just concordance of injuries across the board. I mean, Billy Edwards was our senior guy. We brought in an entirely new quarterback room. I mean, that's an entirely different conversation. You had nobody that was in this room last year that's in the room today, right? And so, and on top of that, like they haven't necessarily, I mean, Billy's a leader. People like him, but he's only been around for however many 8 months, right? So there's only so much you can do with that. And then he doesn't even play, right? And so then you have guys who are sophomores, freshmen, coming in, trying to diagnose the situation. The reason they went with Simmons in the first place is because he's been around the block long enough to know what the hell he's doing, right? Danny's still young. Carter's still young. So I think it's just a combination of all those things that make it so that our offense is where it's at right now.
Yeah, I think it's really well said. Last one here to get us out the door. Honcho asks, so we did, before Iowa, we did a tailgate. We went there. Ask him his thought process on wearing fancy shoes to tailgate bar gates on game day from the great Honcho. I didn't even see
those. Yeah, so those weren't dress shoes. Those were boots. They were oh my gosh, now I can't remember what the hell they're called. But those are boots. You know, they just were clean. You know, because I like to look nice. So I, you know, that's if he's not feeling that, you know, that's his prerogative. But you know, I like to look nice when I'm at games.
Honcho wanted to make sure I got that question in. He is very solid. Always insightful, great stuff. Dude, appreciate you jumping on the show and just bring some context to all of this. For everyone tuning in, a bunch more content coming up. Basketball preview this Friday with Nick Osen. We got a couple football guests coming up. Great stuff as always. Thank you for being part of the community on Wisconsin, and we will definitely talk later.